All right, I believe we are recording. Okay, so I'd like to go over how business works and their pricing models and stuff like that. Just kind of talk through this stuff and see how it actually works. And what we got here is a coffee shop, I guess, and they make a cup of coffee. And this can apply to almost any product, this business model or this architecture. Um, we can replace this with bread, and our cup would be like eggs possibly, and then our lid would probably be like sugar, and then our bean would be wheat. Um, but in this case, I want to stick with coffee because it's more simplistic, and having a cup instead of three agricultural products makes this more unique or different enough to emphasize some aspects that'll happen later on. But this is basically our coffee shop over here. We have an employee, he's making $10 an hour. We have a manager that's making $18 an hour. They pay for rent. And then we have the owner that makes whatever the profit margin is. And so the total cost, how much it actually costs to make this cup of coffee, is $2. The profit that the owner is going to receive is 20 cents. And so our total out the door cost for the customer is going to be $2.20. Now, these numbers aren't accurate. They're just an estimate or a percentage of actual values. So this is more of a conceptual thing as opposed to a factual. If I could model a real business, that would be cool, but they generally don't let you know their numbers. Um, so the coffee shop buys a cup, a paper cup from manufacturer A, and it costs them 5 cents to get that cup. And then they buy a lid from manufacturer B, and it costs them 2 cents. And then they buy the bean, and the bean requires some work, and so that costs 34 cents. Now there's a packaging plant, it has assembly line workers, and those workers cost $10 an hour. And then we have the shipping from the farmhouse to the packaging plant, and the shipping is basically highway truck, if you will, and they cost about $24 an hour. And then we have the farming, the people actually doing the farm hands, the laborers on the farm, and they cost $10. So the $10 in this diagram is going to represent minimum wage. And so what happens when we increase the minimum wage? So we increase, the employee to 15, we increase the packaging employees to 15, we increase the farming company, farm hands to 15. And then what happens is that the bean cost goes up to 64 cents. Manufacturer B, because they have a similar stack of people, their price of the lid goes up to 5 cents. Manufacturer A for the cup goes up to 10 cents. And the coffee house now has to pay their employee $15 plus the additional cost of the cup, the lid, and the bean. And so it's now $2.50. If we don't increase our profit, we're actually going to be losing 30 cents on every cup of coffee we sell. So the owner increases his profit 20 cents above the cost, and now the cup of coffee costs 20 cents or $2.70. The problem with that is now the middle class didn't get a pay raise, but the cost of the cup of coffee went up, and they now can't afford it. Well, it's now more of a burden for them to afford it. And so they start complaining. They want a pay raise. They want what the minimum wage people got. But in reality, they don't get that good of a pay raise. The owner caves in and gives them a pay raise, but it's not as good as what the minimum wage employees got. And so the manager is now making $21, and the highway truck driver is now making $27. So they're content. It covers the increased cost of the coffee, but they're not making as much as they did before. But now these business owners have to cover the cost of the middle class. And so they increase the cost of their products. So the bean goes up to 70 cents, the lid goes up to 7, the cup goes up to 13, and now the cup of coffee is at $2.70. The owner of the coffee shop still wants to make their 20-cent profit, and so now the cup of coffee is at $2.90. This increase, hurts the middle class. It hurts the lower class. They're saying, well, now I got to pay more for this stuff, and I didn't get that much of a pay raise. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about the pay scale of the U.S. currently. This graph represents the median. The most amount of people in our country apparently make around $45K a year. And, we've increased, and so in our little scenario, we've increased the minimum wage. We've increased how much these people make down here. What that does is that pushes this part of the graph towards the middle. But as we discussed, the middle didn't get much of a pay raise, so that doesn't move that much. So the more we increase the minimum wage, the smaller this gap gets. The smaller this gap gets, the closer these guys get to the poverty line. Flipping towards the poverty line, it's because the cost of coffee is going up. The lower class is increasing in cost, but the middle class, their salary isn't increasing as much. So the more times this gets increased, the more times the cup of coffee goes up, the more times, the more this group of people get pushed closer to the middle, but the middle slowly slides back because they're not getting a significant increase. And so they will eventually become the standard of what is considered low income. So that doesn't really help anything out. We'll get to that more in a bit. Let's talk more about what else happens in our economy. So currently we are just looking at if we only lived in the United States and there was no other companies in the world, nobody else out there to buy stuff from. But if there is, and we are in a global economy, the coffee shop owner realizes that he can buy the cup and the lid from China at a significantly lower price. And so he switches over to buying from them. This ends up lowering his cost, and so he now can get a profitable increase. The problem is that these companies, people aren't buying from them anymore. So they're starting to lose money. And so they go out of business. because now everybody's buying from these Chinese companies. Another thing that happens is that he's charging $2.90, which is a 50-cent markup on the original cost. Another coffee company, sets up shop right next to him and says, well, I don't need the $50 cents. I'm going to charge the 20 cents, which forces our coffee shop to lose customers, forcing him to lower his profit margin so he can compete with the guy next door and charge the same amount. So now we're back to $2.60. Another thing that happens is that the farming guy realizes he can get cheaper labor. He finds out that undocumented workers or illegal immigrants, he can pay under the table, and he can pay them like $3 an hour. But this is a shady business deal, and so he doesn't want to let people know, so he only lowers his cost by a little bit, which affects the overall cost of the coffee by a little bit. And so it increases his margin, but it's not significant enough for our coffee shop owner to lower the cost to the customer. This was kind of interesting when I was looking through this or building this discussion, that the farming community is probably lobbying the government to ignore illegal immigration because their workforce is so cheap. And since they can't really show it on their balance sheet that they're saving a lot of money, they're actually making it as profit. So that's interesting. That's probably what's going on. So anyway, now we have this situation here. When we increased the minimum wage, we lost some companies. We've lost some U.S. citizen jobs on the farming side of the house. And our overall cost of a cup of coffee is now expensive, costs a lot. And the managers and the truck drivers, the middle class, actually didn't get much of a pay raise. And so they've slid down closer to the poverty line. So what do we do about it? How do we solve this problem? Well, the one answer is to lower the minimum wage and put our low-level employees back at $10 an hour. But employees aren't just going to go back to $10 an hour. They're going to complain. They're going to push back. They're going to say that they want to make more money. But eventually, either a new coffee shop will come along and hire employees at $10 an hour and start charging less, forcing either our coffee shop to go out of business because they can't compete, or he'll have to start firing employees and hiring new people at $10 an hour. While this will lower the cost of the cup of coffee, it still doesn't bring us back down to where we were. And that's because our middle class is still at a higher dollar rate. But something else happens, and that's now our manufacturing companies can now afford to compete with our China competitors. And they can actually be a little less again. And so our coffee shop may go back to purchasing from them. They probably will because it's cheaper. But this cost savings isn't significant enough to lower the price again. So we're back to the middle class, and we got to figure out how to get these guys to a lower salary range. And more than likely it will, eventually people, business owners will start to cycle these people out for the cheaper, lower paid employees. They'll find somebody eventually that costs what we were at before. It'll take longer, and people will complain that they're not making as much money. But when the cost of coffee has gone from $2.90 all the way back down to $2.30, and eventually back down to $2.20, the people that are making less will say, well, it's not, the stuff I'm buying doesn't cost as much anymore. It takes a while, and it'll take several increments of stepping down minimum wage to get it to a point where this cup of coffee ends up costing 30 cents. And a competitor like China can't even compete because just shipping something from China to here costs entirely too much. And then the other argument is we get to a point where minimum wage is at the cost of what an illegal immigrant is willing to work for. And so the farming company will start hiring U.S. citizens instead of illegal immigrants. So that's kind of it in a nutshell. If you made it this far, I appreciate you guys watching it. I hope you might have learned something. I hope it was educational. If you like it, please click the like button. And if you didn't like it, feel free to leave some comments. Maybe we can start a discussion. If I left something out, or if you want me to go into detail on something else, please let me know. I'll try and make another video if it's important enough for people. But thanks for watching.